the silk sound tearing it through the empty hall like a suffocated scream. It is 1924, and in the wreckage of a mansion in San Francisco, precious fabrics spread across the floor of Carrara marble, like dead flowers of flowers that never existed. Earth-dressed, abandoned on the 17th century Persian rugs, their undone seams revealing the fragility behind opulence. Siberian Zeppelin jackets, flourish, embroidered chettes of Florence, French policing gloves, all marked by the silent violence of lost possession, all witnessing the end of an empire built on the illusion that beauty can be bought and identity can be sewn. Among the rubble of a fortune that once rivaled that of Astor's and Vanderbilt, a woman walks barefoot. His feet, which one day shoved shoes made by the best artisans from Milan, now bleed over baccarat crystal shards that once ordered tables, where dinner was a theatrical performance of status and sophistication. Her hair, once arranged daily with pearls grown in the pure waters of the Pacific, now hang out of shoulders that have already sustained the weight of tiaras that belonged to European royalty. His hands, which one day moved with the grace of those who knew that each gesture was observed and imitated, now tremble as they caress silk ghosts, fabric materialized memories that lost all meaning. This is the last image of Aimée Isabella Crocker, the woman who turned consumption into sacred art, vanity into personal religion, and luxury into a slow, beautiful, and inexorable form of emotional suicide. The heiress who owned everything and found that in the process of possessing, she was possessed. The collector who became a piece of her own collection. The rarest and most fragile object in a museum of obsessions she created herself. If you appreciate stories about the silent decay of the American aristocracy and the dark secrets behind Belle Epoque, about women who built illusion empires and paid with their own souls, subscribe to the channel to discover more narratives about those who dare transform desire into destination and found that some prices are too high, even for the richest. Aimée Isabella Crocker is born on December 5, 1864 in Sacramento, California, in the pulsating heart of an America that was still trying to decide what it meant to be truly rich. The country emerged from civil war as an injured but ambitious nation, and in the Wild West, men like Edwin Bryant Crocker were literally building the future on iron rails. His father was not just one of Central Pacific Railroad's tycoon. He was a visionary who saw before any other that California's real gold was not in the rivers of Sierra Nevada, but in connections that would unite the continent from costa to costa. The fortune of the Crocker family drained by the veins of Californian high society as liquid gold extracted not from the mountains, but from the American geography itself. Edwin Bryant had understood that controlling movement meant controlling power, that possessing the roots meant having the fate of an entire nation. When Aimée is born, in a Victorian mansion that dominates the Sacrament Colinas as a transplanted medieval castle to the New World, it is already heir not only of a fortune, but of philosophy. The world exists to be possessed, and who has more is more. Aimé's childhood unfolds in an environment where each object tells a story of conquest and acquisition. The child grows in rooms where Persian rugs cover Brazilian mahogany floors, extracted from Amazonian forests by workers they will never know. Bohemian crystal chandeliers, each piece individually blown by Czech artisans whose names have been lost in history, hang from hand, painted ceilings by French masters, brought especially to create scenarios worthy of the new American aristocracy. English furniture from the Georgian period divides space with Oriental antiques that arrived in California on the same ships that brought the first Chinese immigrants to work on the construction of the railroad. But it is in the cabinets that Aimé's true education happens, a silent but deep pedagogy that will shape every aspect of its future personality. His mother, Margaret Rhodes Crocker, is a woman of fierce social ambitions disguised under the apparent delicacy of Victorian femininity. Margaret understood, with the cunning of a military strategist, that in 19th century America, where nobility titles do not exist and strains are invented, social status is built through visible symbols of wealth. She teaches her daughter through daily lessons that begin even before Aimée learns to speak, that clothes are not just sewn fabric. They are materialized power, status made visible, identity literally built point to point. At 5, their moe already has a wardrobe more extensive than most adult women of their time. Each piece is a carefully planned lesson. Carmesim velvet teaches about controlled passion, the blue silk on refined seduction, the golden satin on imperial sophistication. Margaret not only wears her daughter, she sculpted her, turning a child into a work of living art, where every detail was designed to communicate specific messages about power, refinement, and social superiority. The girl learns that a woman without ornaments is a woman without voice, that beauty is a coin that can buy anything: love, respect, admiration, lasting memory. But more important than that, she absorbs a dangerous lesson: that her identity does not exist regardless of the objects that adorn it, that she's not a person who wears clothes, but an extension of the clothes she wears. It is an education that seems privileged on the surface, but is planting the seeds of hunger that can never be satiated, a dependence that will grow until it consumes not only its fortune, but its own essence. What is built in these early formative years is not only refined taste or aesthetic appreciation, but a visceral dependence that acts almost as a chemical addiction. Aimée does not learn to wear clothes. She learns to be the clothes. Its identity merges into the fabric so completely that it develops an inability to conceive itself as a separate entity from its ornaments. It is a dangerous formation for a girl who will inherit one of America's greatest fortunes, because when money has no limits, obsession will not have them either. No one in the Crocker family realizes, in these golden years of childhood, that they are creating not an heiress, but an addict. That each new dress is like a dose of a powerful drug, which each test session is a ritual that reinforces growing dependence. At the age of 10, Aimée can no longer feel complete or real without being properly ornate. She developed what will later be recognized by psychiatrists as the first signs of dependent personality disorder, but a dependence not on people, but of objects, such a rare condition that has not even a name in the medical literature of the time. In 1878, at 14, Aimée is sent to Dresden, Germany, to complete his education at an exclusive boarding school for daughters of the international elite. The decision is not made by whim, but as part of a carefully planned strategy by parents to turn their daughter into the most sophisticated Americana of their generation. The Institute for Höhere Töchter, directed by the Baroness von Seckendorf-Aberdar, is known to receive only the daughters of the most powerful families in Europe and the Americas, an environment where Russian princesses divide dormitories with heirs from German industrialists and daughters of American tycoons. The transatlantic journey marks the first major transformation experience through international scale consumption. Steam that takes her to Europe, she discovers that the world is an infinite catalog of desires waiting to be fulfilled. With each stop, London, Paris, Hamburg, it is exposed to new forms of luxury, new patterns of sophistication that make the sacrament refinement seem provincial. In Parisian studios from Rue de la Paix, she first sees what true haute couture means. In Viennese jewelry, he learns that there are precious stones that she didn't even know existed. In La Barfly-Cedery's, he discovers textures that appear to have been woven by fairies. Each port is a new opportunity for acquisition. Each buys a small victory over the void that began to form on its chest, a void that it still does not understand, but that feels as a constant hunger, a sense of incompleteness that only possession of beautiful objects seems temporarily calm. The bags that accompany her on the trip multiply with each stop, transforming her educational journey into a commercial expedition that impresses even the standards of the time. Dresden becomes his University of Vanity, a city that in the 1870s still shines with the splendor of the Second German Reich. The capital of Saxony, known as the Florence of Elba, offers Aimée an apparently infinite catalog of refined desires. Under the Baroness' tutelage, she studies music with teachers who taught members of the royal family, literature with academics graduated from Heidelberg, ladies with ladies who served at Vienna's court. But its true specialization, the one in which it demonstrates almost supernatural talent, is in conspicuous consumption elevated to the art level. The streets of Dresden, flanks of boutiques that sell objects created by the best artisans in Europe, become the laboratory where Aimée develops what will later be recognized as the first clinically documented case of album of purchases at ALA American Society. But it is not just buying that attracts it. It is the whole ritual around the acquisition. It develops elaborated ceremonies for each purchase, fasts before visiting certain stores so that the mind is purified to receive beauty, meditations about the choice between different options, local numerologists to determine the most auspicious days for each acquisition. Instituto teachers notice their peculiarity with a mixture of fascination and concern. Aimée not only buys objects, she visually devoured them, tactily, emotionally. Their cards home, written in an increasingly fluent German, describe tissues with the passion of a lover describing the body of the beloved, jewelry with the fervor of a religious describing mystical visions. The golden brocade whispered me old secrets of the Byzantine emperors, he writes at the age of 15. The pearls cried tears of pure beauty against my skin as if they recognized in me a soul sister born to adorn them. It is a language that alarms and delights your family, a poet of possession, a mystique of materialism that seems to have discovered a completely new religion. During these formative years in Europe, Aimée develops what she calls, in intimate letters for an American friend, incomplete syndrome. No wardrobe will ever be large enough, no collection will ever be rare enough, no acquisitions will ever completely fill the hole that seems to grow in your chest in reverse proportion to the growth of your fortune. It begins to buy objects not by necessity, or even with aesthetic pleasure, but with a deeper and darker compulsion, as if each new acquisition could fill an existential void that it feels but cannot name. The other girls in the Institute, even those coming from the richest families in Europe, begin to see it as an exotic creature, almost supernatural in their consumer capacity. They have money, but Aimée has something different, a hunger that seems infinite, an ability of desire that transcends any practical or aesthetic need. Some envy her, some fear her, but they all recognize that they are in the presence of something unique, a person who has transformed the act of buying into an art form, but also in a form of self-destruction. When he returns to America in 1880 at 16, Aimée brings with him 42 bags of clothing, 60 pairs of shoes, 300 pieces of jewelry, and an obsession that will define not only the rest of his life, but the rest of his identity. She doesn't know yet, but is carrying the instrument of her own destruction, carefully polished and refined by the best artisans in Europe. His education has been completed, not just in music, literature, and label, but in the most dangerous art of all, the art of confusing being with having, essence with appearance, soul with ornament. In 1883, at the age of 19, Aimée marries Robert Henderson Porter, an established family diplomat that represents everything that conservative American society values: emotional stability, social discretion, moderation in all things. Porter comes from a lineage of statesmen and jurists who helped form the institutions of the young American Republic. Man of impeccable education, graduated from Harvard and versed in classical literature, he sees in Aimée not only a rich heiress, but a work of living art, a woman who embodies the sophistication that America is trying to build to rival Europe. The marriage is celebrated at the family mansion in Sacramento, in a ceremony that costs more than the annual budget of entire Californian cities. Aimée wears a dress by Charles Frederick Worth, who needed 6 months to make a 30-meter masterpiece, especially for the occasion, embroidered with Mikimoto pearls still alive when taken from the oysters, blind made lace finishes that dedicated years of their lives to a single meter of delicate plot. The dress is not just a wedding clothing, it is a statement of power, a statement that America can create beauty that rivals anything produced by European workshops. But the real spectacle does not happen on the altar of the Episcopal Church in front of 300 guests who include governors, senators, and business moguettes. It happens in the 6 months of preparation before the ceremony, when Aimée transforms the process of setting up their trousseau into an impressive artistic performance and alarms in equal measures. She hires the best tailors of Paris, New York, and London, not to make conventional clothes, but to create what she calls fabric poems, pieces that tell stories, which evoke emotions, which transform them who wears them into characters of an unhealthy drama. Each dress of your layette is conceived as a complete visual narrative, each accessory a carefully built metaphor. There is the Spring in Versailles dress, made of water-green silk with flower embroidery that appear to be blossoming in the fabric itself. The Autumn Melancholy set, in purple velvet with shit, skin details that suggests both royalty and mortality. The Dreams of Cleopatra collection, inspired by its growing obsession with Egyptian antiquity, with fabrics that mimic hieroglyphics and jewelry that reproduce pharaonic amulets. Its final trousseau includes 300 pieces, catalogued as if they were artwork in a museum, each accompanied by a descriptive record that details not only the fabric and making, but the emotional inspiration and the historical context of the piece. There are dresses for occasions that do not yet exist, costumes for social roles that it does not yet occupy, fantasies for versions of herself that she expects one day to become. It is a wardrobe that reveals not only wealth, but an imagination that has transformed personal identity into a collective artistic project. Marriage itself reveals the first great contradiction of Aimée's life. She marries genuine love. Her intimate letters leave no doubt about her deep feelings by Porter, but expresses this love through consumption, as if objects were the only language in which they can communicate real emotions. Porter, a man of simple tastes and conservative values, watches with growing alarm while his wife transforms each social event of his new marital life into an opportunity for ostentation that goes far beyond what society considers appropriate, even for people of its social position. Intimate dinners for close friends become fashion shows where Aimée appears with different clothes with each dish served. Honeymoon trips become shopping expeditions that leave impressive invoices even for the standards of one of America's richest families. Social complimentary visits become display sessions where every detail of their appearance has been carefully calculated to communicate specific messages about status, sophistication, and purchasing power. The European honeymoon lasts 6 months and leaves a trail of invoices that impresses even the cosmopolitan high society of the time. In Paris, Aimée empties 3 whole studios, buying not only ready clothes, but ordering exclusive collections that will take years to be completed. In London, she acquires the full content of a centenary jewelry that attended the British nobility for generations. In Vienna, she buys a wardrobe that belonged to an Austrian archduke, not because she needs clothes, but because she wants to have the story they represent. Porter begins to suspect that he did not marry a woman, but with a force of nature. A storm of silk and ambition that cannot be contained by the conventional limits of marriage or understood through the normal categories of human psychology. He sees with growing concern that his wife does not wear clothes to express his personality. She uses her personality to express clothes. The distinction is subtle but fundamental and marks the beginning of a tension that will grow until it becomes unsustainable. What neither one understands completely is that Aimée is not spending money in the conventional sense of the term. She is spending herself, converting her essence into objects, her soul into material possession. Each purchase is simultaneously an expression of power and a form of surrender, each acquisition a way to become more real and to disappear a little more. It is transforming in its own collection, becoming both curator and main part of a museum dedicated to an identity that exists only through objects. The years that follow marriage mark the transformation of Aimée, of a woman rich in a cultural phenomenon, a metamorphosis that American society observes with increasing fascination. Established in a mansion at Fifth Avenue, in the heart of the new New York aristocracy, it becomes the most requested host of high society. But its meetings are not conventional social events. They are museological exhibitions where it is simultaneously curator and main part, hostess and show, person and living artwork. Your home becomes a maze of preciousness that challenges conventional residential decoration categories. Each room is dedicated to a different historical period, not just furniture and art objects, but in a complete recreation of the atmosphere and the spirit of past times. The main hall reproduces a 16th century Venetian palazzo, complete with fresh carried stone by stone of Italy and furniture that belonged to ducal families. The music salon evokes the court of Louis XIV, with original Aubandon rugs and a clove that Mozart may have touched. The Eastern Hall. It is a reimagined Ottoman harem, with Damascus silk, covered divas, and Islamic art objects that it acquires through an increasingly sophisticated network of international traders and smugglers. Aimée's daily routine becomes a sacred consumer ritual that impresses even the extravagant standards of the American Golden Era. Each morning, she receives in her private suite, an environment that reproduces Marie Antoinette's room in Versailles, a carefully heeled selection of traders who bring the most exclusive news in the fashion and antiques world. Cartier jewelers arrive with unique pieces created specifically for her. Worth representatives have sketches of collections that have not yet been shown even European royalty. Chinese silk traders bring fabrics that have been fabrics in Buddhist monasteries and never touched Western hands. Persian rug sellers unfold masterpieces that tell stories of lost dynasties. It is an infinite procession of temptations that it can rarely resist, but its relationship with these objects transcends simple consumption. Aimée developed what she herself describes as material empathy, the ability to emotionally feel the history and meaning of the objects she has. Not only does she buy a dress, it absorbs all the emotions that have been invested in its creation, from the designer's inspiration to the work of seamstresses who devoted weeks of their lives at each point. Not only get a jewel, she connects with all the women who used her before, feeling their joys and sadness as if they were their own memories. Its employees, an army of 15 people dedicated exclusively to maintaining their collection, learn to recognize the signs that precede their compulsive consumption crises. When Aimée gets restless, when her fingers drumming nervously on the marble tables, when her eyes acquire that particular shine she describes as beauty hunger, it's time to call suppliers. These episodes can last days, during which she buys non-stop, as if trying to fill a hole that deepens each acquisition. Porter watches the phenomenon with increasing fascination and terror. His wife developed what he describes in private letters to his family as hunger that feeds on himself, an addiction that creates his own object of desire. She not only buys, she devours. Not only does it have, it is possessed. Mansion cabinets multiply as cancer cells. New floors are built exclusively to accommodate acquisitions. Specialized employees are hired only to catalog and maintain the growing collection that begins to assume their own life. But it is at Aimée itself that the most dramatic and disturbing changes manifest themselves. It begins to change multiple clothes times a day, not for conventional vanity or aristocratic whim, but for compulsive need to try different identities, as if each dress brought with it a different version of itself. Each exchange is an elaborate ritual, fragrant baths with specific oils for each character, careful selection of jewelry that complements not only clothing, but the emotional state it wants to achieve, hair arrangements that evoke specific historical periods. Each dress brings a different persona. The blue silk of the French aristocrat gives him a refined melancholy. The golden brocade of the Byzantine empress arouses in it a majestic severity. The black velvet of the romantic widow evokes a delicious sadness that she cultivates like a garden of rare emotions. She is fragmenting into 1,000 versions of herself, all equally artificial, all equally necessary for her feeling of really existing in the world. New York society celebrates it as a charming eccentric, the American princess that brings European glamour to the New World. But the most observers, especially women in their own social class, begin to notice something disturbing. Aimée is losing their ability to exist without ornaments. Until her clothes, without her jewelry and accessories, she seems to be physically decreasing, as if the objects were a literal part of her body structure, as if her identity depended on no internal qualities, but external decorations that need to be constantly renewed and expanded. What is happening to Aimée is more than aristocratic eccentricity or elevated feminine vanity to the extreme. It is the first documented manifestation of a condition that modern psychology will recognize as pathological materialist dependence, a condition in which personal identity becomes so tangled with material objects that one loses the ability to conceive as a separate entity from their possessions. She is becoming a person who has things, but it has other things, a collection that collects itself. In 1895, Aimé's obsession reaches a new level when she discovers the haute couture workshops of Paris during the peak of Belle Époque, a period when the French capital became the world center not only of fashion, but of an entire philosophy about beauty, luxury, and refinement. Charles Frederick Worth, the legendary English seamstress who revolutionized female fashion by turning tailoring into art, becomes not only his supplier, but his new deity into a growing pantheon of artists and artisans that she revere with almost religious fervor. Worth, a keen man of commercial vision disguised under artistic air, quickly realizes that Aimée is not an ordinary client, even for the high standards of his clientele that includes empresses, princesses, and the richest women in Europe and America. Not only does it order clothing, it finances entire collections, sponsors the development of innovative techniques, and essentially becomes the muse and patron of a generation of fabric artists who see not only a source of income, but an opportunity to raise their work to pure art level. Its relationship with tailors quickly transcends the commercial and enters the territory of the sacred, a devotion that alarms even the eccentric patterns of Parisian society of the time. Aimée develops elaborate rituals around each new order that transform the process of making clothes into a complex religious ceremony. Fasts of 3 days before tasters, so that the body is purified to receive the new creation, meditations on the choice of fabrics that can last weeks. Each color and texture must resonate with its emotional state. Consultations with numerologists, astrologers, and even mediums to determine the most auspicious dates to debut each piece. The tailors themselves, initially skeptical about the eccentricities of their American client, gradually begin to see her not as a rich woman with strange whims, but as a supernatural force, a goddess of vanity that can raise them to fashion Olympus or destroy them with a single disadvantage. They learn to participate in their rituals, to respect their superstitions, to treat her with the reverence she clearly expects, and that they find she is willing to pay any price to receive. It is during this period, at the height of its wealth and social influence, that Aimée makes the mistake that will define its future ruin. It begins to give tailors access directly to their bank accounts, obsessed with the idea that every second waiting for a new creation is a second stolen from the absolute perfection she seeks. She authorizes automatic debts, signs blank checks, and establishes transactions that dispense her prior approval for anything related to the art of beauty. Art cannot wait for the bureaucracy, he says in an interview with French Vogue that he becomes immediately famous in haute couture circles. Beauty should flow freely, like a sacred river that does not know artificial barriers. When an artist has a vision, when a fabric calls in a specific form, when a jewel begs to be created, money must follow immediately, without question, without hesitation. What she does not realize, blinded by the intensity of her own obsession, is that tailors, initially dazzled by the seemingly unlimited generosity of their American patron, gradually begin to take advantage of their compulsion in increasingly sophisticated and systematic ways. Invoices are inflated with positions by artistic consultations that have never happened. Unnecessary works are performed in the name of absolute perfection. Parts are deliberately lost during the process of making and multiple regulations, always with additional costs that are automatically debited from their accounts. Aimée, completely immersed in her aesthetic obsession, not only does not question these progressive abuses, she interprets them as signs of extraordinary artistic dedication, as proof that she is dealing with true masters who do not transide with mediocrity. The more expensive the process, the more elaborate, the longer, the more it is convinced that it is investing in truly unique masterpieces that justify any financial sacrifice. Its cabinets now house more than 1,000 individually cataloged dresses, 500 pairs of shoes organized on the occasion, and color, 300 hats each created to complement specific sets. It has clothes for occasions that will never exist, costumes for personas that will never assume, fantasies for versions of itself that exist only in its increasingly disconnected imagination of reality. But the collection became autonomous, growing on its own impulse, fueled by the SIS financial theme she has created herself, and now works regardless of her will or control. Tailors no longer work for Aimée. Aimée works for tailors, their entire life reorganized around the need to feed the consumer machine it has built itself. Social agenda, their travels, even their personal relationships are planned according to the studio's production cycles. She lives in the time of others, in the pace of fashion stations, in the perpetual expectation of the next creation that promises to bring the completeness that the previous one could not provide. Porter, observing this transformation of his wife from patron to victim, collector to collected, tries to intervene multiple times, but finds that Aimée has developed a system of psychological defenses elaborated to protect his addiction. Any questioning of its spending is interpreted as a lack of artistic understanding. Any suggestion of moderation is seen as bourgeois philistinism. Any attempt at financial control is received as betrayal of its essential nature. The year 1912 marks the beginning of the end, when Porter, increasingly alarmed with the spending of his wife, who have grown exponentially since his move to Paris, decides to discreetly investigate family finances with the help of private auditors specializing in large fortunes. What he discovers literally leaves speechless for 3 consecutive days. In less than a decade, Aimée spent the equivalent of 40 million current dollars exclusively on clothing and accessories, an amount that represented almost a third of family fortune built over generations. But more shocking than the astronomical amount is the systematic and elaborately criminal nature of the exploitation that investigations reveal. Auditors discover a complex network of fraud orchestrated by the Tailors themselves, in whom it has deposited their absolute confidence, such a sophisticated criminal structure that impresses even researchers, accustomed to dealing with large-scale financial crimes. Investigations expose false invoices for materials that have never been purchased, double collection for unique services disguised through confused technical terminology, creation of completely imaginary pieces that exist only on paper but are charged as if they had been produced with the most expensive materials, unauthorized sale of items from their personal collection with the profits pockets by the Tailors themselves, who then charged again to reset the lost pieces. The famous Worth studio, discover researchers with increasing horror, charge for a single gala dress equivalent to the annual salary of 50 specialized workers, justifying the price through a list of exotic materials that included silk woven by Tibetan virgins in sacred fast, and embroidery made with golden wires blessed by the Pope, materials that, obviously, never existed outside creative imagination of fraudsters. Other studios developed even more elaborate schemes, creation of artistic subsidiaries, fictitious that charge separately for each stage of the process of making, from inspirational conceptual design to final energy harmonization, undergoing completely invented services such as consultation with specialists in color psychology and numerological analysis of compatibility between fabric and client's personality. When Porter confronts Aimée with the meticulously documented evidence, document piles, photographs, testimonials of corrupt staff, her reaction is even more devastating than any explosion of anger or hysterical denial could have been. She simply can't process the information. For years, she has confused systematic theft with artistic devotion, criminal exploitation with creative genius, financial abuse with love for beauty. His reality was built on such a fundamental lie that questioning it means questioning not only its choices, but its own existence as a person. For decades, she believed she was loved by Tailors, who was respected as patron, who was valued as a muse. Discovering that it was seen only as an easy source of income, a convenient victim whose compulsion could be manipulated indefinitely, destroys not only his confidence, but his basic understanding of how the world works. "They loved me," she whispers repeatedly, flipping through the falsified invoices with fingers that tremble like dried leaves. "They understood my soul, they saw my need for beauty, they helped me become who I really am." The discovery that this narrative was completely false, that his sole artistic twin was actually a criminal commercial operation, leaves it without psychological foundation to continue existing in the same way. The discovery of betrayal coincides with AIN perception. The most terrible, Aimée can no longer stop buying, even though he is being stolen, even seeing his family. Fortune disappears at rapid speed, even though he intellectually understanding that each new acquisition makes it poorest and more vulnerable. Compulsion became greater than his will, stronger than his reason, more fundamental than his survival instinct. It has developed a dependence that acts as a chemical addiction by consumer rituals. The specific smell of new fabrics triggers physiological responses, similar to drugs. The texture of unpublished silks produces release of endorphins. The feeling of newcomer possession generates peaks of dopamine that it needs to experience regularly to feel functionally normal. To stop buying, for Aimée, it doesn't just mean changing habits. It means facing literal abstinence syndrome that includes tremors, sweating, uncontrollable anxiety, and deep depression. Porter fits with divorce in March 1913, alleging in legal documents irreversible temperamental incompatibility resulting from compulsive behavior that endangers family assets and emotional stability of marriage. In private deposits, he describes Aimée as a woman who has lost himself in her own richness, who drowned in her own abundance, who became a prisoner of unlimited freedom to consume. It is a poetically accurate description for a very real tragedy. Aimée becomes the first documented victim of the pathological consumerism of the modern era, a phenomenon that psychology of the time has neither vocabulary to describe nor methods to treat. It is a pioneer not only in luxury consumption, but in the specific suffering that this type of consumption can cause when it becomes the organizing center of a human life. Alone and still obsessed, Aimée enters the 1920s as a ghostly figure of American high society, an elegant spectrum that haunts the halls where she once reigned as an undisputed queen. His fortune, once considered inexhaustible even by the patterns of the Golden Age, began to show obvious signs of exhaustion that not even the accounting creativity of its financial managers can disguise. But she can't, or don't want to, adjust her behavior to the new economic reality. The psychology of scarcity is completely strange to someone who has spent a lifetime believing that money was infinite, that desire was inalienable right, that beauty was absolute need. She continues to spend as if she still had unlimited youth resources, just now without family supervision, without social breaks, without anyone to protect her from herself. It's like watching someone trying to breathe underwater, an automatic reflection that has become fatal. It is during this time that tailors reveal their true nature with cruelty that impresses even the cynical patterns of the fashion industry. Those same men who treated her as a goddess when she had millions to spend, who competed for the honor of wearing her, who created exclusive pieces in her honor, now see her as a problem client, indebted, unstable, still addicted, but without adequate resources to feed their vice in a profitable way for them. They begin to demand early payments for work they use to make in full trust, to charge interest on late payments, to treat it with the cruel condescension reserved for decay rich who have not yet accepted their new social position. Some reach the point of refusing their requests completely, claiming that their unstable financial situation poses a very high risk to workshops who need to protect their reputation. Humiliation is both social and psychological. Aimée discovers that in the economy of haute couture, loyalty and friendship are purely commercial concepts that disappear the moment the money stops flowing. Men who swore eternal devotion to their unique aesthetic view now not even return their letters. Artists who proclaimed that she was her inspiring muse suddenly discover new muses with more solid financial resources. Desperate to maintain appearances and feed a compulsion that has grown beyond any rational control, Aimée tries to discreetly sell pieces from his collection through intermediaries that promise absolute discretion. But it discovers a bitter truth about the luxury market. Objects bought by obsession have no real value in the secondary market. His worth dresses, his rare jewelry, his unique accessories, all proves virtually invitable by a combination of factors that make his situation even more desperate. Many pieces have been made specifically for their measurements and do not serve in other women. Others are so specific, so elaborate, so obviously created for particular occasions that there is no demand eel for them. And he found that the second-hand market for ultra-luxury articles is tiny, specialized, and controlled by the same traders who participated in their original exploitation. Each sale is a small emotional death she feels, physically in the body. Each piece that leaves your home takes with it a portion of your identity, a specific memory, a version of itself that it has cultivated over the years. The process is not only emotionally painful, but physically debilitating. She develops tremors in the hands that prevent her from holding delicate objects, chronic insomnia that leaves her awake whole nights reliving memories of lost clothes, a dramatic weight loss that makes her look like a ghost of silk and bones walking through the corridors of her increasingly empty mansion. Society that once celebrated her as a charming eccentric now avoids her with the cruel instinct that the rich develop to detect and repel relative poverty. Their eccentricities, once seen as aristocratic charm, are now interpreted as signs of mental instability that can be contagious. Invitations to social events stop coming, first the least important, then the medium prestigious ones, finally even the charity events where their presence was once considered essential. Courtesy visits cease completely when the news is spread that Aimée can apply for loans from other women to finance their compulsive purchases. Traders stop answering their calls when they find that their checks may not have enough funds. Even their domestic employees begin to treat it with the lack of specific respect that the servants demonstrate when they realize that their salaries may be at risk. Aimée discovers that in America, poverty, even the relative poverty of a woman who still has a mansion and created but can no longer spend unlimited, is more scandalous than any other kind of behavior. A woman can be adulterous, alcoholic, even slightly insane, and still maintain her social position. But a woman who can no longer pay her bills, who needs to sell her personal effects, who poses financial risk to others, this woman becomes instant social output. Progressive isolation for the forced to confront for the first time in its adult life the possibility of existing without constant ornaments, without the validation that comes from having beautiful objects, without the identity it has built through decades of carefully healed acquisitions. It is a confrontation that it is not psychologically equipped to face, having spent 50 years avoiding exactly this situation through increasing spending. In 1924, Aimée lives practically alone in his San Francisco mansion. an architectural structure that became a monument not to wealth, but to the specific loneliness that poorly spent wealth can produce. The house, once a vibrant temple to refined consumption, now looks like a mausoleum, where each object is both relic and ghost, both memory and silent accusation. Whole rooms have been closed to save on increasing maintenance costs that your reduced income can no longer cover properly. Precious collections were covered with white sheets that turned them into silk spectra, reminders of an opulence that has become unsustainable. Runners that one day echoed with the characteristic sound of whispers against petticoats elaborated now reverberate only with the lonely echo of footsteps that seem to look for company that no longer exists. The house's own architecture seems to have adapted to the melancholy of its owner. Windows that once filtered golden light to enhance the colors of Persian rugs now let only gray clarity that emphasizes the accumulated dust over abandoned objects. Mirrors that once reflected 1,000 different versions of Aimée, adorned in their best clothes, now show only one woman who has aged prematurely, not for the years, but for the weight of understanding that she built her life on sand foundations. She developed strange and touching rituals to deal with growing loneliness and the emptiness that no amount of objects could fill. Every morning, in a ceremony that became as regular as prayer for other people, she walked slowly through the closed rooms, discovering a different piece of her collection with the reverence of an archaeologist manipulating sacred artifacts, talking to each object as if she were an old friend whose stories need to be remembered not to get lost completely. They are unilateral conversations where it recalls not only the circumstances of each acquisition, but the specific emotions that each object represented, the versions of itself that each piece helped to create or sustain, the dreams and expectations that each purchase seemed to promise accomplish. "You made me feel like a Byzantine princess," whispered to a black pearl necklace. "You were my armor against insignificance," he confesses to a purple velvet dress he hasn't wore for 5 years. After these conversations, she covers each piece again with the delicacy of those who are preparing a dead for the funeral, a gesture that became mourning ritual for versions of itself that no longer exist, by possibilities that were consumed along with the objects that represented them. The few employees who are still left in the house, reduced from 15 to 3 for economic necessity, describe her as a woman who has aged not chronologically but existentially. She finally understood, with terrible clarity, that she built her identity about a foundation that was never solid, that each object that owned her more completely returned, that her collection was not an expression of her personality, but a gradual replacement of her. There is particular cruelty in the way objects now behave in relation to their owner. Dresses that once seemed to whisper promises of beauty and power when she played them now hang so on cabinets, as if they had lost the communication capacity she imagined possessing. Jewelry that shone with their own life when worn in society now look like dead stones in dusty boxes, without the social context that gave them meaning. The collection she imagined that immortalization has become the most accurate record of her progressive dissolution. Thousands of silent objects that witness not her past greatness, but her gradual transformation into nothing more substantial than the objects that defined her. She finally understood that she became a curator of a museum dedicated to a person who may never really existed, just a series of customs temporarily elaborated by the illusion of personality. The latest letters from Aimée, discovered years later in an ebony desk that belonged to Marie Antoinette, reveal a terrible lucidity that contrasts painfully with decades of self-illusion. I thought they had things, but they had increasingly complete. That now I am just the sum of objects that can no longer define me, because I found that they have never really defined me. They just occupied the space where personality should have grown. In other letters, she reveals that she developed the ability to see her own life with the cruel objectivity of an external observer. "I lived 60 years without ever finding out who I was when you were undressed. Now I know the answer. I was just anyone. It was just the empty space between clothes, the absence that the jewelry was trying to fill, the silence that the silks were trying to cover. There is nothing in me that is specifically mine, nothing that cannot be reproduced with enough resources." It is an understanding that comes too late to allow any kind of redemption or reconstruction, but at least offers the bitter dignity of final clarity over your own condition. The death of Aimée Crocker, on February 12, 1941, is discovered 3 days later by Margaret O'Sullivan, an Irish maid who worked for the family for more than 2 decades, and was one of the few people who witnessed both the heyday and the decay of his employer. Aimée is found in her main room, wearing an ivory-colored silk camcushion that bought in Paris 50 years earlier. One of the few pieces she never considered selling because, explained to anyone who wanted to hear, it was the first clothes that made me feel truly beautiful. The room where he died was carefully arranged as if it were a theatrical setting for his final match. It is surrounded by photographs of itself in different eras and different clothes, a chronological gallery of abandoned identities that acts as a personal museum of a life lived entirely in third person. He has been in his 20s in his wedding dress, at the 30 an imperial ball costume, to the 40 characterized as an Eastern empress, to the 50 as a romantic widow. Each photograph shows a different woman, as if she had lived several lives in a quick sequence, each defined by the costume she used. But the most disturbing and revealing discovery comes during the detailed inventory of their goods, led by lawyers, who needed weeks to completely catalog the contents of the mansion. In the last year of life, even with severely limited financial resources, Aimée had discreetly resumed his compulsive purchases with an intensity that impressed even researchers stamped with eccentric behaviors of high society. She spent the latest available features of the family on a series of seemingly practical, meaning acquisitions, dressed in sizes that had not wore at least 2 decades. Her body had dramatically diminished with age and melancholy. Feet shoes that arthritis had deformed to the point of making any footwear and soft slippers. 2 heavy jewels to her fragile body to carry without considerable physical pain. Investigators find stacks of never-opened boxes stacked in whole rooms. Shopping bags, still sealed with the original labels of the most expensive San Francisco stores. Items with still affixed price labels that reveal that she continued to pay premium prices for objects she would never use. It is as if, in recent months, she had desperately tried to recapture through consumption every year lost, all abandoned identities, all the happiness she imagined having found in the stores and studios of her youth. Even more disturbing is the discovery that it had developed the habit of buying multiple versions of the same item. 5 virtually identical dresses, 10 pairs of gloves in the same color, 15 wipes with similar embroidery. As if trying to ensure that certain pieces could never be lost again, or as if buying individual objects, but the very experience of owning, repeated as many times as they could fund. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Harrison Webb of the University of California, reveals that Aimée officially died of age-related heart failure, but those who knew her intimately know that she died of something much more specific, from the emotional exhaustion of trying to be so many different people for so many years that he completely forgot who was really under all customs. Her heart has stopped not of organic disease, but of loneliness, the particular and devastating loneliness of those who confuse having to be, who exchange soul for ornament, who discover too late that identity cannot be bought in any store, no matter how expensive or exclusive. It was a death that Aimée herself would have described as poetically appropriate, to die not of illness, but of emptiness, not of excess physical, but of existential lack. Your will, a legal document of 40 pages handwritten on paper tone with your gold, embroidered initials, is an endless list of catalogued objects with the obsessive accuracy that characterized your entire adult life. Dresses for museums that show no interest in receiving them, jewelry for distant heirs who do not exist or do not know of their existence, furniture for houses that will inevitably be demolished to give way to commercial enterprises. It leaves behind a collection without a true collector, a museum without interested visitors, a meticulously organized file of a life that was lived through material power of attorney. It is an inheritance that reveals more about the void that tried to fill than about any fullness it has achieved. The most tragically ironic aspect of her death is that she died literally surrounded by thousands of objects she bought to combat loneliness, but completely alone from the human point of view. The objects that imagined that they would accompany her and define forever revealed themselves inadequate company at the end. Decoration changes to a life that became, herself, decorative. 6 months after his death, Aimé's collection is auctioned by Casa Sotheby's at an event that lasted a whole week and attracted curious collectors and art traders from 3 continents. The auction, pompously announced as the sale of the century, the legacy of a visionary collector, should have been a final celebration of refined aesthetics that Aimée cultivated throughout his life, a posthumous validation of its importance as the patron of the arts and referee of taste. But what should have been a celebration quickly transforms into a melancholy and brutal revelation on the fundamentally transient nature of material value and memory associated with personal objects. The very dynamics of auction, intimate personal effects being transformed into public commodity, private memories being converted into business opportunities, seems like a posthumous violation of women who dedicated their entire lives to treat objects as sacred extensions of their personality. Many of the pieces that Aimée paid fortunes to acquire, especially those she considered unique masterpieces created specifically for her, are sold by insignificant fractions of her original prices, not because they lost material quality or historical relevance, but because they completely lost the emotional and social context that gave them meaning when used by their owner, Al. A Worth dress that cost the equivalent of a luxurious apartment in Manhattan is sold by less than the monthly salary of a specialized worker. The rare jewels, separated from the woman who used them and the social life in which they shone, become only stones and metals evaluated by weight and purity, not by history or symbolic meaning. The objects she imagined that immortalize her are dispersed by the world as sterile seeds, carrying her memory but her progressive forgetfulness. The auction lasts 3 consecutive days, And with each passing day, prices decrease and the public interest crumbles in a predictable but painful way to observe. On the first day, some of the most spectacular items still attract attention and generate competitive throws. On the second day, pieces that were one day the center of Aimée's social life are sold at purely decorative prices. On the third day, objects that she considered unique treasures are grouped into theme lots and treated as cheap curiosities for beginner decorators and amateur collectors without specific knowledge about her provenance. It is a posthumous humiliation that she could not have imagined in her worst nightmares. Seeing her life transformed into cheap commoding, her passion reduced to numbers into a commercial catalog, her carefully built identity dissolves into the impersonal mechanism of the market that does not recognize sentimental value or personal meaning. But perhaps the most cruel and revealing irony is that some of the tailors themselves, who systematically explored it for a lifetime, appear in the auction as opportunistic buyers. Some of them can get back, for cents in the dollar, pieces they sold to Aimée for small fortunes decades earlier. It is the final and complete revenge on the consumer market. Not only has it been stolen for a lifetime through elaborate fraud, but its most precious objects return to the same hands that explored it, completing a perfect cycle of capitalist predation that works both before and after death. There's something obscenely poetic in the image of these men, now aged but still recognizable, examining with cold eyes the same dresses that once described to Aimée as divine manifestations of earthly beauty. They manipulate tissues that witnessed decades of obsession, evaluate jewelry that saw tears of joy and despair, calculate the value of objects they know intimately because they participated in their creation and their fraudulent monetization. The money raised in the auction, after paid inheritance taxes, legal costs, commissions of auctioneers, and other administrative expenses, can barely cover the debts that Aimée left behind. Ironically hired debts to buy objects that are now sold by fractions of their original cost. Its family fortune, methodically built over generations on iron rails and American dreams, dissolves completely within a week, not in a large headlines worthy of headlines, but in the slow and silent death of 1,000 small unnecessary purchases accumulated over decades. The newspapers of the time cover the auction with the cruelty disguised of cultural interest that characterizes the press when it comes to the decay of the rich. At the end of an era, the Crocker collection disperses, title San Francisco Chronicle. When luxury becomes burden, Lessons of the Inheritance of an Heiress analyzes the New York Times. But none of these articles can capture the true tragedy of the event, not the loss of material objects, but the final demonstration that an entire life dedicated to acquisition has resulted in nothing more permanent than a footnote in the annals of conspicuous consumption. The most bleak aspect of the auction is the presence of only 3 people who really met Aimée as a person. Margaret O'Sullivan, the Irish employee who found her dead, Dr. Harrison Webb, who has attended her in recent years, and surprisingly, an elegant middle-aged woman who identifies herself only as a friend of Dresden, probably one of the German boarding school colleagues, who has maintained sporadic contact over the years. These 3 people observe silently while the life of someone they have known is transformed into a commercial show, while objects that have been used and loved are reduced to catalog numbers and market values. Its presence acts as a melancholy memory that behind all the ostentation was a real person, a person who was lost in his own abundance, but was ultimately human enough to be remembered by someone. When the last lot is sold and the last buyer leaves carrying its acquisition, the Crocker mansion is empty for the first time in over half a century. The silence that is established is not only the absence of sound, but the absence of meaning. A space where each object had a story becomes only empty architecture waiting for new occupants that will create new meanings. The story of Aimée Crocker ends where he began, in the silence of an empty house, but now it is a fundamentally different silence. Not the expectant stillness of the wait, but the final mute of the conclusion. His mansion in San Francisco was demolished in 1952 to give way to a commercial parking lot that serves a modern shopping center. Irony is so perfect that it seems to have been planned by a particularly cruel God with a sense of humor, where a woman has destroyed herself through compulsive consumption, becomes a space dedicated to facilitating other people's consumption. There are no commemorative signs marking where she lived, no monuments celebrating her contributions to American culture, no museums dedicated to preserving her collection or memory. The woman who imagined that she would be remembered through her possessions was forgotten along with them, dissolved at the same speed as her objects were dispersed by the world. But perhaps this erasure is the only appropriate and honest way to honor its real story. Aimée Crocker has not been the victim of an isolated personal tragedy or individual failure of character. He was the victim of a collective illusion that still haunts our time with even greater force. The fundamental belief that we are what we have, that identity can be bought in stores, that happiness is price-defined in coins that can be accumulated and spent. She was the first conscious martyr of modern consumerism, the first woman to completely get lost in the maze of mirrors that capitalism systematically builds around female desire. Its tragedy was not personal, but cultural. It led to its most extreme logical conclusions, the messages that its society constantly sent to women of their class and position. His life reveals uncomfortable and still pertinent truths about the female condition in a society that teaches women from childhood that its value is on the surface, that its importance is measured in ornaments, that its voice is heard only when properly dressed. Aimée took this logic, seemingly innocent, to his most extreme conclusions, and found that at the end of the journey there was nothing but the echo of his own steps in empty corridors decorated with objects that lost all meaning. Modern psychology would recognize in Aimée clear symptoms of dependent personality disorder with obsessive-compulsive characteristics. But its time had no vocabulary to describe, or methods to treat, a condition that was simultaneously individual pathology and broader cultural symptom. It pioneered not only in luxury consumption, but in the specific suffering that this type of consumption can cause when it becomes the organizing center of a human existence. Today, when we see digital influencers building entire identities through clothes and accessories shown on social networks, when we witness the explosion of the retail therapy phenomenon as a socially accepted way of dealing with emotional problems, when we observe whole generations of women confusing self-esteem with consumer capacity, the story of Aimée Crocker resonates with the timely and disturbing attempts. It was our contemporary born an early century, or perhaps we are your heirs, born a century too much to learn from their mistakes. Technologies have changed, the objects of desire have diversified, the methods of acquisition have sophisticated, but the fundamental logic remains the same, the promise that buying enough, accumulating enough, properly being able to become who we really are. The difference between Aimée and contemporary compulsive consumers is not in nature, but of scale and speed. It needed decades to destroy itself through consumption. Modern technology allows the same process to happen in years, or even months. She needed great family fortunes to feed her addiction. Contemporary credit systems democratized financial self-destruction. It was socially isolated as a consequence of its excesses. Modern social networks have transformed isolation into a public spectacle. What remains of Aimée Crocker is not your worth dresses or rare jewelry, all scattered, lost, or destroyed by time, but a question that echoes through the times with growing urgency. In a culture that systematically teaches us to define us through what we buy, how do we really be under all the ornaments, marks, and objects we accumulate? She dedicated 60 years of life to try to answer this question through the most direct method possible, buying everything that was possible to buy, and died without finding the resumption. There, or perhaps having found the most terrible answer, that under all the ornaments there was nothing, that it had only become the empty space between objects, the absence that the goods were trying to fill. Perhaps the answer to your question does not exist. Or perhaps it can only be found through methods that our consumerist culture makes it increasingly difficult to imagine or practice. Perhaps the question is more important than any possible solution, functioning as a constant memory that there are aspects of human experience that cannot be bought, sold, or possessed. Aimée Crocker has made us the most valuable gift a life can offer, a beautiful and terrible warning about the dangers of confusing soul with surface and looking essence, being with having. Its history acts as a mirror where each generation can see its own temptations and weaknesses related to consumption, identity, and the search for meaning through material objects. In the end, she got exactly what she always wanted. She became unforgettable, not through their clothes, which were disintegrated or forgotten, but through their emptiness, which echoes over time. Not through his collection, which was dispersed, but through his loss, which he continues to teach. Not through what he bought, but through what he sold from himself in the process. His soul, his identity, his ability to exist regardless of the objects he had. This is the definitive heritage of Aimée Crocker, a broken mirror where each fragment reflects a different facet from the human condition in a time of increasing material abundance and spiritual hunger. To look at her is to look at ourselves and find out that we may have more in common with the heiress who was stolen by her tailors than we would like to admit. His life teaches us that true poverty is not the lack of objects, but the inability to exist without them. That true wealth is not in what we have, but in what we are able to be when stripped of all possessions. That true beauty cannot be bought, but only discovered in places that no store can ever access. Aimée Crocker died alone in a room full of objects, surrounded by everything he always wanted to possess, but discovering too late that he had forgotten to own herself. It is a lesson that our time urgently needs to learn, before more women get lost in the same maze of mirrors where it has disappeared, a maze built not by malevolent external forces, but by a culture that systematically teaches that having is more important than being, what appearance is more valuable than essence, that consuming is a valid way of existing. The last word about Aimée Crocker must be themselves, extracted from a letter found in his desk after his death. I spent my whole life trying to become real through objects that I found out too late. It was less real than me. Now I know that the only really valuable thing I have was the time I spent looking for myself in the wrong places. Buy, that no store can sell, that no tailors can sew.